All right, so are you ready for another deep dive?
Always ready.
Awesome. So today we're tackling voter ID laws.
Ooh, that's a hot topic.
Yeah, it really is. And there are so many questions like, do these laws actually help? Do they actually protect our elections? Or do they just make it harder to vote? What's the real story?
Yeah, it's a debate with strong opinions on both sides.
For sure. And that's why we're diving deep, right, to try to sort through all of it. And get this, we've got a ton of different sources for this deep dive.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, we've got some stuff from the Heritage Foundation. They're big on voter ID laws.
Okay.
And then to shake things up, we've got some news articles coming out of Arizona.
Interesting.
And even some FBI insights on, election crimes, the real deal.
Wow, that's quite a range.
I know, right? And hold on, it gets even better. We're going to sprinkle in some thoughts from the All In podcast crew.
Oh, I like those guys. They always bring up interesting points.
I know, they make you think.
Yeah.
So are you ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with the Heritage Foundation. They're all about voter ID laws. They say they're crucial for preventing fraud and keeping our elections, squeaky clean.
Okay, I'm listening.
So they bring up this case in Missouri. Turns out some Somali citizens were actually convicted of voting illegally. And then there's this other case in California. They say a congressional race was impacted by non-citizens voting.
So they're saying these are examples of why we need stricter voter ID laws.
Exactly. They're saying, look, this stuff happens. But, it makes you think, how often does this really happen?
Right. Is it enough to justify, nationwide voter ID laws?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. What else does the Heritage Foundation say?
Well, they're adamant that voter ID laws don't suppress minority turnout.
Okay. How do they back that up?
They point to Georgia and Indiana. They claim voter turnout actually went up in both states after they started requiring voter ID.
Interesting. So it's not about disenfranchising voters. It's about making sure every vote is legitimate.
That's their argument. But then we get to these news articles out of Arizona, and things get a little messy.
Ooh. What happened in Arizona?
So apparently there's this coding error in their voter registration system.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, not good.
Huh?
And because of this error, they mistakenly classified a bunch of voters as, totally eligible for full ballots.
Wait, so people who shouldn't have been able to vote were told they could?
It seems that way. At first, they thought it was almost 100,000 voters.
Seriously, 100,000?
Yeah. But then, get this, they revised that number.
Oh, no. How many was it really?
218,000 voters.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It's a huge glitch.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder about the systems we have in place, like if a coding error can potentially affect that many voters.
Yeah, it makes you think about how effective our current systems really are.
Exactly. And there's more. So this organization, the Strong Communities Foundation, they requested this list of, potentially ineligible voters.
Makes sense. They want to investigate.
You'd think so, right? But here's the kicker. They're actually prohibited from contacting those voters or sharing that information.
Hold on. What? They can't even contact them. Why not?
It's like this weird balancing act between transparency and protecting voter privacy. They released the list, but with all these restrictions.
It's complicated. We want accurate voter rolls, but we also need to protect individual rights. It's tough. But I think it's time to bring in the FBI perspective now. What do they have to say about election crimes and security?
Okay, so the FBI is, they're focused on federal election crimes.
Of course, it's the FBI, federal jurisdiction.
Right. And for them, that means stuff like ballots with federal candidates on them, misconduct by election officials, false voter registration.
Intentional targeting of minorities.
Yep, that too. And violations of campaign finance laws. That's their main focus.
Got it. So what kind of stuff is not considered a federal crime, according to the FBI?
Things like offering people rides to the polls, not a federal crime.
Interesting.
Or even making false statements about a candidate. Nope, not a federal crime, according to them.
So there's a clear distinction between federal and state election laws.
Exactly. It's more complicated than just yelling election fraud.
Right. It's about jurisdiction and the specific types of offenses.
And speaking of, the All In podcast guys, they actually dive into this whole voter fraud thing.
Oh, yeah. What do they say?
Well, they bring up those Heritage Foundation cases, the ones we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
And they point out that even though the Heritage Foundation has like 1,600 documented cases of voter fraud, none of them happened in Georgia during the 2020 election.
Interesting. No cases in Georgia.
None that they found. And then, get this, they compare that with the Brennan Center's estimated fraud rate.
And what is that?
Somewhere between 0.0003% and 0.0025%.
Whoa. So basically, the Brennan Center is saying voter fraud is extremely rare.
Yeah, that's their take. And the All-In guys, they don't stop there.
They never do. What else did they bring up?
Well, they brought up Trump's attempts to, overturn the election in Georgia, like that phone call where he asked officials to find him votes.
That infamous phone call.
That's the one. And all those lawsuits he filed.
Right.
And their argument is basically, it's statistically impossible to swing a presidential election through voter fraud.
That's a bold statement. But it leads us to another fascinating topic, trust. Trust in media, trust in information.
Oh, yeah, here we go. This is where it gets really interesting. The All-In podcast actually brings up some Gallup poll data showing that confidence in TV news, well, it's plummeted.
Really? People don't trust TV news anymore?
Not as much as they used to, it seems. And there's this really interesting partisan divide.
Oh, tell me more.
So, Democrats seem to have the most trust, then independents, and then, way down at the bottom are Republicans.
Wow, a real partisan split on trust in the media?
And the All-In guys, they have this really interesting analysis of why that is. They say traditional media has basically shifted from delivering straight information to focusing on, more emotive content.
Ah, so it's less about facts and more about feelings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All about grabbing attention and getting clicks. But the All-In folks think that's a big reason why trust has gone down. People feel like they're being bombarded with opinions instead of facts.
That makes sense. It's hard to trust a source that seems biased or emotionally manipulative.
Totally. And then they bring up this specific example. Remember that Joe Rogan interview with Trump?
The one that got tons of views.
Yeah, like maybe over 100 million by now. But they say it was actually pretty hard to find on YouTube, even though it was super popular. And they're like, maybe this is evidence of bias on the platform, burying content they don't like.
That's an interesting point. But we have to consider the role of algorithms, right? Search engines don't just randomly show results.
That's true. I actually got curious about that myself. So I tried searching for the interview on a few different search engines.
What happened?
Well, it's true. The clips from the interview were actually higher up in the search results than the full episode.
Ah, so people are searching for the highlights, the most exciting parts.
It seems that way, which makes sense if you think about it, right? People want the sound bites, the most shareable moments. And those clips are designed for that. They're attention grabbing.
So it might not be intentional bias. It could just be the algorithm doing its thing, trying to show people what they want.
Maybe. But the All-In crew wasn't totally convinced. They brought up some other stuff that seemed kind of fishy.
Like what?
Well, they said when they searched for Donald Trump on Google, one of the top results was actually about Kamala Harris.
Huh. That's weird.
Right. And then when they searched for Trump-Rogan interview, they got an article from the Arizona Republic.
The Arizona Republic. I'm not familiar with that one.
It's a pretty small publication, but their article, it was basically calling the interview brain-rotted.
Whoa. So maybe there's something to this bias thing after all. It's weird that a relatively obscure article would be ranking so high for that search.
Right. The All-In guys, they even suggested interviewing someone from Google to try to get some answers, to really understand how these algorithms work.
It's a valid point. If we're going to rely on these search engines for information, we need to understand how they're making decisions.
Absolutely. So here we are. We've got voter ID laws, worries about election integrity. The media landscape is changing like crazy. And now there's this potential for algorithms to be biased. It's a lot to take in. What are your thoughts? What stands out to you so far?
Well, honestly, what really strikes me is how interconnected everything is. Like the whole debate about voter ID laws, it's all fueled by concerns about election integrity. And then those concerns are made even worse by the fact that people don't trust the media as much anymore.
Right. It all feeds into itself.
Exactly. And then you add in the whole algorithm thing, and it's like another layer of complexity. Because if algorithms are choosing what information we see, or maybe even hiding some information from us,
it can totally warp our perception of reality.
It's scary to think about. So, yeah, it's a lot to process.
For sure. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, folks. We're going to dive even deeper after the break. We'll try to untangle this web and see what other connections we can find. Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've been wading through all this stuff about voter ID laws, election integrity, the media landscape, and honestly, it's a lot.
It really is. Maybe we should take a breather for a sec, just try to connect some of the dots,
Yeah.
before we get totally lost.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Help me out here. What have we learned so far?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is this whole tension between security and accessibility when it comes to voting.
Right. Yeah.
On the one hand, you've got groups like the Heritage Foundation. They're all about voter ID laws. They say it's the only way to stop fraud and protect our elections.
And on the other hand, you've got people saying those laws could actually end up disenfranchising certain groups of voters,
Yeah.
making it harder for them to actually vote.
Exactly. It's like this balancing act, trying to protect the system, but also making sure everyone can participate. It's tricky.
It is. And then you throw in that whole Arizona situation with the voter list.
Oh, yeah. That doesn't help.
I mean, come on, a coding error that messes up the registration of over 200,000 voters. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. And it definitely raises questions about, how reliable are our voter registration systems? Are they up to snuff?
Exactly. Because if something like that can happen, a simple glitch, how can we be sure that the voter rolls are actually accurate?
Right. It just highlights how important it is to have really strong verification procedures. But at the same time, you don't want to make it so hard to register that you accidentally disenfranchise eligible voters. It's a tough needle to thread.
It really is. So, okay, we've got the voter ID debate going on, the Arizona thing raising all these questions. And then, oh yeah, the whole declining trust in the media thing.
Can't forget about that. That's a big piece of the puzzle.
It is. And the All In podcast. They had some pretty interesting things to say about that, remember?
Yeah, what was their take again?
They were saying that traditional media has basically shifted from, reporting the news objectively to focusing more on emotional content.
Ah, so it's more about grabbing your attention than giving you the facts.
That's their argument. They think it's all about getting clicks and eyeballs, and that's why trust in the media has gone down. People are tired of feeling manipulated.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're drowning in information, but we're actually starving for real knowledge. There's just so much noise out there.
That's a great point. It's hard to know what to believe anymore. And then just to add another layer of complexity, you've got the potential for bias in search engines themselves.
Oh, yeah, the algorithm thing.
Exactly. Because if the algorithms are choosing what information we see and maybe even hiding some information from us, well, that has huge implications for how we understand the world.
It really does. And remember that whole controversy about the Joe Rogan interview with Trump?
The one that was supposedly hard to find on YouTube?
Yeah, that's the one. It kind of made you think, right? Like, maybe there is some kind of bias going on behind the scenes. Maybe the algorithms are pushing certain viewpoints and burying others.
Yeah, and we were talking about how those shorter clips, the highlights from the interview, were actually ranking higher in the search results than the full episode itself.
Right, because they're designed to be more shareable and engaging. So it makes sense from a platform perspective.
It does. But it also makes you wonder, are we getting the full story? Are we missing out on important context?
That's a really good question. And it's not just about algorithms either. Remember what the All In podcast said about some of their Google searches? Like getting a Kamala Harris article when they searched for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and that obscure article from the Arizona Republic calling the Rogan interview brain-rotted. That was weird.
It was. And, they even suggested trying to interview someone from Google to understand better how their algorithms actually work.
Which is a great idea, because if we're relying on these platforms to get our information, we need to know what's going on behind the curtain, right?
Absolutely. So, okay, to recap, we've got this whole debate about voter ID laws, concerns about election integrity, the media is changing, and now we've got potential algorithm bias on top of everything else.
It's a lot. It can feel pretty overwhelming.
It really can. But I think it's important to remember that knowledge is power. The more we understand about these issues, the better equipped we are to, navigate the world.
You're absolutely right. We can't just sit back and let things happen. We have to be informed. We have to be engaged.
Exactly. We need to be active participants, not passive consumers. So what does all this mean for the average person? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think it boils down to this. We need to be critical thinkers. We can't just blindly trust any one source of information, whether it's a news network, a podcast, a social media post, whatever.
Right. We can't just take things at face value. We have to dig deeper, question our assumptions, and, form our own opinions based on the evidence.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about, right? It's not about giving you all the answers. It's about giving you the tools to ask the right questions.
It's about empowering you to be a more informed and engaged citizen.
Exactly. Because these issues, they're not just abstract concepts. They have a real impact on our lives, on our democracy. They shape how we see the world, how we vote, how we interact with each other. So we can't afford to be passive observers.
We need to be active participants in shaping our own future.
And that means being informed, being critical, and being engaged. It's not always easy, but it's worth it.
I agree. So, to wrap things up, why don't we challenge our listeners with a little experiment?
I like it. What do you have in mind?
Go on Google and search for voter ID laws. Simple as that.
And then what?
Pay attention to the results you get. Think about how the information is presented, what sources are being prioritized, and whether you can spot any potential biases. It's a fun little exercise that can reveal a lot about how these search engines work.
It is, and it's a great way to start putting those critical thinking skills to work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because remember, the more we understand about these algorithms, the better equipped we are to, navigate the digital landscape.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe you'll even uncover some surprising insights along the way.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've been going pretty deep on voter ID laws, election integrity, and, the whole media landscape. And before we wrap up, there's one more thing from that All In podcast that I think is worth talking about.
Oh, what's that?
They were talking about how we might be seeing a shift in how we, engage with political candidates.
A shift. How so?
Well, they're saying it's not just about traditional media anymore, like the way candidates are portrayed on TV news and stuff.
Okay, I'm following.
They think we're moving toward this more direct-to-consumer approach.
Direct-to-consumer, you mean like candidates going straight to the voters?
Exactly.
Interesting.
Think about it. Platforms like podcasts and social media, they're giving candidates new ways to, bypass those traditional gatekeepers.
The media, you mean?
Yeah, they can just go straight to the voters with their message.
I see. So it's like cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. And they brought up that Joe Rogan interview with Trump as an example.
Oh, right, the one we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. They're saying that long-form interviews like that, they give voters a more unfiltered view of the candidate. They can hear them talk at length, in their own words, without all the spin and the sound bites.
Right. It's like having a personal conversation with them.
Exactly. And it's not just podcasts either. Think about social media. Candidates can just post their thoughts, their policies, their announcements directly to their followers. No filter.
That's true. It gives them a lot more control over their message.
Totally. And it gives voters more access too, right? They can see a wider range of perspectives, get information directly from the source.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's not all sunshine and roses, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are potential downsides to this too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, if we're not getting information through those traditional channels, like the news media.
How can we be sure what we're getting is accurate?
Exactly. And how do we know if it's biased or not? Especially when trust in traditional media is already so low.
It's a valid concern. It's like we're trying to avoid bias by going straight to the source, but how do we know if the source itself is biased? It's tricky.
It really is. I think it comes down to critical thinking. We have to be more careful than ever about evaluating information, no matter where it comes from.
Absolutely. We can't just blindly trust any source, whether it's CNN, Fox News, Joe Rogan, or even the candidates themselves.
Right. We have to do our own research, fact check, consider different perspectives.
Think for ourselves.
Exactly. And that's kind of a perfect way to wrap up this whole deep dive, don't you think?
It is. It all comes back to that idea, being an informed and engaged citizen.
Right. And remember, we're not saying we have all the answers. We're just trying to ask the right questions.
Exactly. And hopefully we've given you some tools and some food for thought to continue exploring these issues on your own.
Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power.
And the more we know, the better decisions we can make. Not just for ourselves, but for our communities, our country, our world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and keep those minds curious.